My watch says that it's 11 already, and I think it's time to start our talk. We are going to present the first results of our study of verbal borrowings and code-switched verbs from Albanian in the speech of Balkan Slavic bilinguals. Our goal is to study how Albanian verbs behave in Slavic speech in situations of actual Albanian Slavic contact. We will take a look from the perspective of code switching and from the framework of adaptation of verbal borrowings. One of the main problems in the studies of bilingual speech, which will be addressed in our presentation, is how to distinguish between lexical borrowings and switches when it comes to single words from one language included into the speech in the other language. It is generally believed that code switching does not involve adaptation of the embedded foreign element, while borrowings are always adapted and integrated into the recipient language system. According to Shana Poplak, for example, the main linguistic criterion for distinguishing between a code-switched word and a borrowing is the morphological and syntactic integration of the latter. The degree of phonetic integration may vary both with switches and with borrowings and is not an absolute criterion. However, this linguistic criterion of adaptation seems to be insufficient. Other important criteria are conventionalization, which implies that borrowings are conventionally used as part of the recipient language, and frequency of usage. If particular concepts are very frequently or regularly expressed by foreign words, these words are likely to be borrowings. Unfortunately, it is almost impossible to check for these criteria when you are in a field, when a researcher is able to collect only a limited amount of text from a limited number of speakers. Also, to claim for conventionalization of some foreign word, it is better to ensure that this word is used not only by bilinguals, but also by monolinguals, a task which is not always accomplished when the field work time is limited. And actually, in some communities, there are no monolinguals at all. For example, all Albanians in Ukraine who are able to speak Albanian also speak Russian. So you cannot find monolingual Albanian speakers to check for some Russian words in their Albanian speech. Anyhow, we are going to deal here with the bilingual communities of the Balkans and study them from two perspectives. In our code switching framework, we accept one of the numerous definitions for code switching, which says that code switching is the alternate use of two or more languages in the same utterance or conversation. In our study, we will distinguish between multi-word switches involving verbs, code switching proper or intrasentential code switching in the terminology of Carol Myers-Cotton, and single word inclusions, which can be either intrasentential switches or borrowings. In our analysis of integration of Albanian verbs in Slavic speech, we ground on the typology of verbal borrowings developed by Jan Bolgemuth. In his monograph, based on a large sample of borrowed verbs from over 350 languages worldwide, he proposes four main strategies of loan verb accommodation. First, the direct insertion strategy, the direct insertion of the input form, which without any morphological adaptation into the recipient language. For example, when an English verb download is borrowed into German in the example 1. The infinitive suffix is attached directly to the loan verb, just as it would be to a native stem. Second, the indirect insertion involves adaptation by overt verbalizing affixation of some kind. Example 2 shows the use of affix R in Greek loan verb accommodation. Third, the light verb strategy usually results in complex predicates with auxiliary-like verbs in the recipient language. The verbs do and make are used cross-linguistically, as in our example 3 from the Albanian dialect in Ukraine, where Russian verbs are adapted in the form of Russian infinitive and combined with the Albanian verb boy, which is to do, which is inflected for tense, person, and number. So the Russian infinitive служить can be adapted in this dialect as bun служить, bura служить, and so on. Lastly, in a few very rare cases, the loan verb is not adapted to the recipient language's morphology at all, but is borrowed along with significant parts of the donor language's verbal and inflectional morphology. This morphology maintains its function in the recipient language, thus creating a new and usually closed inflectional class. The strategy is called the paradigm insertion, and such inserted paradigms, for example, exist in several Balkan Romani dialects, which were described in one of the latest articles by Victor Friedman. The material for our study is from the well-known 4-volume monograph by Celal Ulle and Claude Steinke about the Slavic dialects in Albania. We did not consider several single villages from the monograph, although they are also interesting for study, and concentrated on 4 major regions where Slavic dialects are still spoken in Albania. The region of Prespa Lakes on the Albanian side, and for this region we have texts from 9 villages, and the text corpus, which is collected and transcribed by Steinke and Ulle. Yeah, so here's our area. The text corpus collected by Steinke and Ulle contains roughly 45,000 words. Second, we use text from the 15 villages of Golo Bordo in the west of Albania with approximately 58,000 words. Third, we have a corpus of text from 9 villages of Gora in the northwest of Albania with approximately 32,000 words. And lastly, the text from the 6 villages of Vraka in the northwest of Albania, which is the only region here pertaining to the Serbo-Croatian rather than to Bulgarian Macedonian dialect continuum. And from this region, we have roughly 19,000 words in of text published in Steinke and Ulle's monograph. We calculated the overall number of single word and multi-word Albanian inclusions in the 4 text corpora and the number and share of different kinds of switches. In this slide, we show only verbs, which are of major interest in our talk, nouns, because across many language pairs, most of the words that are borrowed are nouns, and multi-word switches, phrases or clauses which may involve a verb, but sometimes do not involve it. Several important observations are highlighted here in the slide. So let's consider them left, right. First, we see that Albanian inclusions, whether they are multi-word switches or single-word switches or borrowings, are more frequent in the Slavic speech of Goloborda and Gora, based on the share of the switches in text, than in Prespa and Vraka. Here we calculated the share of the switches from the total number of words and texts. Second, Albanian verbs are most equally frequently used in the Slavic speech of the 4 regions. If we consider the share of such inclusions taken from the total number, which is shown in the second column of the table. Third, nouns seem to be equally frequent in Prespa and Goloborda, and less frequent in Gora and Vraka. In general, they overwhelm all other types of Albanian inclusions. They make up a half or almost a half of the total amount. And fourth, multi-word switches or the inclusion of sentences and phrases is much more frequent in Vraka than in the other regions. Now let us concentrate on Albanian verbs used in Slavic speech of bilinguals of the 4 regions. They can be used as part of a sentence or phrase, as shown in the column part of a multi-word switch. And in this case, they are obviously non-adapted. Verbs are also used as single word inclusions, either adapted or not. We may notice that in Vraka, verbs are mainly used as part of multi-word switches. Thus, I will not consider Vraka in my further examples, but my co-author will mention it again in the general discussion and conclusions in the end. In the other regions, we may note that verbs are mostly adapted, Yeah, and that in Goloborda, we have the lowest amount of non-adapted verbs. When it comes to adapted verbs, now let us consider them. There is one strategy which is the most common in 3 regions, Prespa, Gora, and Goloborda. The Albanian verbs ending in yot in the first person singular of the present tense, like krijoj, caktoj, festoj, vazhdoj, in the upper table. These verbs comprise the most numerous and productive class in Albanian, and all these verbs are adapted in the Slavic speech with the suffix ov or uv, as also seen in the upper table. Forms like krijovano can be found from the verb krijoj, festuvame, festovjano, se festuvat, from festoj, etc. Albanian verbs with consonant stems like perdor and pergatit in the lower table can be directly inserted in the recipient Slavic dialect, as shown in the examples that I labeled as A. For example, the verb pergatit gives us forms like pergaditena, pergatituima. The verb ždukam disappear is adapted and used like iždukile or uždukile, especially in Gora. But these verbs also often follow the most common strategy with ov, uv, and this common strategy is marked as B in my table. So forms like perdorovame or pregativeshe from these verbs are also possible. To interpret this strategy, we may note that on the one hand, in Macedonian and instead in Macedonian and instead in Bulgarian, for sure, there is a suffix like uva, ova, va, which derives imperfectives from perfectives, like sednova, keep sitting down. This suffix is also productive in forming verbs from other parts of speech, especially from nouns. And Bulgarian grammars say that in general, the main verbalizer for foreign verbs in this language is the suffix ir. However, imperfective suffixes like uva and ova can be also used for adaptation of foreign verbs in spoken Bulgarian. And, here I found different Bulgarian verbs which mean to form in one of the Bulgarian grammars. Yeah, so on the other hand, in Albanian, we have aorist of the verbs in yot, the first and the second person singular, which is derived by means of a formant v, which is originally an epithetic consonant, like kalova in the example 6 on the slide. So the Slavic uva, ova forms and Albanian forms of aorist in va seem to clash in our bilingual settings. Albanian and Slavic formants act as morphological elements which can be identified in a contact situation due to their relative phonetic similarity. This is called homophonous words or diamorphs in the terminology of the famous researcher of bilingualism and language contacts, Peter Maeskin. There are several other strategies of verb adaptation. I'm not going to comment all of them here because of the lack of time, but only one strategy definitely deserves attention because it is very frequent in Gora and exists only in this region. You may see the verbs in the examples Stegon ga tresujemo sa jezik arnautski, stari go znali da go prpunojsat. The old people knew how to process it with an Albanian verb perpunoj, and well, the example 7 is with the Albanian verb nkatroj. To explain these verbs and these forms, we shall bring to attention another productive suffix in Balkan Slavic, which is the Greek sa or Greco-Turkish disa. And verbs in sa are often perfective and form imperfectives by means of uva with prefixation deriving new perfectives. I cite here an example from Victor Friedman's of Standard Macedonian. For example, the noun kalai gives us the perfective verb kalaisa with the derived using the suffix sa, and then kalaisuva, the imperfective verb derived by addition of a second suffix uva ova. Albanian verbs like perpunoi, this example 8b shows how they look like, may be transferred into the speech of Gorani exactly in the form of the first person singular of the present tense. And the Albanian inflection yot, in this case, may be identified with the formant e, which also appears before f in the verbs like boyadis, or occasionally as part of the root, as you can see in the cited form kalaisova. So it's again kind of identification which is facilitated by a degree of phonetic similarity, probably. And finally, we may see how non-adapted Albanian forms can be easily included into Macedonian sentence frame. This strategy is generally avoided in Prespa, Gora, and Goloborda, as was shown in the statistics, but several examples can be found. Some word forms can be used independently, as in 9, we just have here the first person plural of the Albanian verb pergatis, pregatitim. However, the second example, 10, ne znam da špjegoj, shows how Albanian verb can be included in the otherwise Slavic construction with the particle da, which shall be followed by an inflected verb form. And this is facilitated probably by the fact that Albanian also has an equivalent of this construction with the subjunctive particle t and an inflected verb. The structural similarity of the constructions facilitates the use of the non-adapted Albanian inflections. Yeah, so this was our material, and now Alexander Rusakov will give some generalizations and conclusions.
Thank you very much. Yes, at the beginning, I will say some words about the code switching in general. We might see in the table that the total amount of the different types of Albanian code switching is the ratio of the number of code switching to the general number of the words of our text. This ratio does not differ in Goloborda and Gora. Most Albanian verbs in this location are adapted. It may be explained by a similar social linguistic situation. Both regions represent a typical example of a language island with a rather good first language maintenance. And we have here both in Goloborda and in Gora that very good transmission of the Slavic language to the children. On the contrary, Prespa region demonstrates a lower level of code switching, respecting borrowing, and some speakers in Prespa avoid Albanian verbs nearly absolutely. We don't know, of course, the reason of it, but we may suppose that the constant presence of the school teaching of Macedonian may be one of these reasons. In the socialist time, the Prespa was the only Albanian region where the school teaching of Macedonian, of standard Macedonian, was allowed. Maybe it is the reason, yes. A relatively high amount of code switching in Raqqa, at the contrary, may be the consequence of the ongoing language shift. According to Ure and Steinke investigations, the transmission of the Slavic language in Raqqa is the transmission of Slavic language to the children is now interrupted, and the language so is on its way to the total language shift. Despite the different level of code switching in general, the ratio of verbal inclusions to the other part of speech among code switches or borrowings is rather constant in all locations and vary from 15 to 18%, and this difference is not statistically significant in our case. And this amount is very close to the typological data in the Tadmer loanwords database, where the total amount of verbal borrowings among all borrowings is 14%. The majority of Albanian verbs in our text corpus are used in adapted forms. The ratio of adapted and non-adapted verbs in 3 regions, except Raka, don't differ significantly. And we have 2 adaptation strategies. The main strategy is the indirect insertion. And this strategy strongly predominates in our data. In the most consolidated way, this strategy is realized in Gлагола and Prespa, the use of one adaptation suffix of, resembling phonetically the Albanian aoristic ending. So we have here the generalization of the special dialect model, rather alien to the both standard Macedonian and Bulgarian. In Gora, we have the coexistence of several adaptation suffixes. The use of the direct insertion strategy is rather sporadic. Maybe the most interesting theoretical problem of these verbal elements is what are they borrowings or code switching? We think that this problem may not be resolved according to our data. We have no possibility to differentiate in our text, as nearly elsewhere, the cases of code switching and the cases of borrowing, because we cannot control for conventionalization and frequency criteria. Nevertheless, we may suppose that some verbs used in our text repeatedly in adapted forms are rather borrowings than code switching cases. Among them are važdovjeme from Albanian važdoj to continue, and some other forms which are represented in Gлагола and Gora, caktovana from Albanian saktoj to set, to nominate in Prespa and Gлагола, and some other verbs. The unadapted verbs are used mostly within long Albanian language islands. It has multi-word switches, including intersentential code switching. The use of single not adapted verbs don't exceed 15% in all 3 regions. And the total amount in Gora, Gлагола and Prespa is 22. It is a rather small amount. Sometimes these uses represent a kind of optional islands in the Myers-Scotton's terminology. They represent metalinguistic comments, some kind of repetitions, etc. Sometimes the non-adapted Albanian verbs are used in analytical constructions which are isomorphic in both languages. For example, in the subjunctive constructions, in the future constructions, and so on. And we have here maybe something that resembles the congruent lexicalization according to late Peter Maisken. Anyway, we don't think that these cases may be interpreted as examples of consistent realization of the paradigm insertion strategy. These cases, we have such cases in the Balkans, for example, some Balkan Romani dialects with the insertion of Turkish paradigm in the Turkish verbal learn words, as well as outside the Balkans, some languages, indigenous language in Russia demonstrate this paradigm transfer from Russian languages. But in all these cases, the majority, the absolute majority of borrowing or code-switched verbs demonstrate these strategies. They are used in the language with their inherited flexion system. In our case, we have rather sporadic insertions of such verbal forms, and thus we don't think that they represent the cases of language borrowing. Rather, it is sporadic cases of code switching. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing the screen.
Благодаря за интересния доклад на Мария Морозова и Александър Русаков. Сега искам да дам думата за дискусия. Остават ни още 4 минути за въпроси, отговори на български, английски, руски, който какъвто език иска да говори. Заповядайте. Има ли въпроси, идеи?
I have a small. Since you talk about differentiation between code switching and borrowings, in case of small volume of data, what is the strategy to make the difference anyway?
Alexander Yuryevich, вы или я?
Давайте вы.
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer. Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, this is the main problem which is faced by all researchers who study code switching, not only in the Balkans, but also the famous Mer Scotland and the famous Shanna Poplak always say that actually you may easily define if the word is morphologically or even phonetically adapted, but this does not make it boring. You also need to know, is it really frequent or is it conventionally used, as we showed in our first slides. Yeah, and in a small amount of data, it's usually almost impossible to define it. Well, sometimes in some situations, we may make some more or less reliable suggestions about borrowing and code switching. For example, in the situations of long-standing diaspora, like Albanians in Ukraine, you know, they left the Balkans in the 18th century, and it is clear, it's understandable that they do not have the maturity of words describing the modern world. They do not even have the word army, for example, or something like that, because serving in the army was not a typical thing for them in the 18th century, 19th century. So you meet many words that are definitely borrowings, but there will be cultural borrowings, definitely. The issue of so-called core borrowings, you know, the words which do not refer to cultural notions, it's always much more different. As for us, I think we cannot also give an exact answer how to distinguish.
Thank you.
Имаме време за още един кратък въпрос.
Аз имам един въпрос, Биляна.
Да.
Да. Мы посетили Голоборда в рамках экспедиции в 96 году. Я могу подтвердить, что наши наблюдения и ваши не особенно различаются. Только хотела бы спросить, у нас был такой случай, может быть, тоже у вас, и я недостаточно внимательно следила, и, может быть, пропустила, вы сказали, когда некоторые слова уже заимствования вошли в системной лексике словаря этого диалекта, они в ходе собеседования вовлекают другие, код-свитчинг совершается после этих заимствований, которые Мейскинс называет triggers. Вот, например, у нас такой
Само кратък въпрос, да, защото вече наистина трябва да минавам в следващия доклад.
Агроном – это заимствование. Когда он говорит, я имам агроном и лард. Агроном вовлекает и лард. Или, скажем, со Бугария, со тректи. Тректи – это заимствование.
Професор Руселина, навлязохме във времето на другия доклад. Съжалявам, навлязохме във времето.
Нет времени на ответа.
Да,
вот я могу очень кратко только сказать, что такие случаи действительно бывают в нашем материале. Да. То, что действительно заимствованное албанское слово является триггером для использования еще албанских слов. Да, мы подтверждаем.
Просто албанские, а не заимствование. Спасибо.
Да, такое есть. Спасибо большое. Thank you very much.
2 минути опоздание.
Сега е време да преминем към следващия ни доклад. Следващия доклад, който е на Марек Майер от Лодския университет за произхода на източнославянските трансгресиви на ник. Маша, please do Marek the host, Marek Майер. If you could do him a host. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Oops, sorry, I need to allow Zoom to share my screen. I thought I had done it before, but I didn't. Okay. Just 1 second, I need to log in once again to Zoom to allow it. I'm very sorry. Be right back. Okay. Okay. Can you see it now? Can you see the screen?
Виждаме всичко, Марек, виждаме.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Right, so thank you for the invitation. Докладът ще бъде на английски, но ако някой иска да зададе въпрос на български, ще се опитам да отговоря. Тоест, ще се опитам да разбера въпроса на български и да отговоря на английски, може би. Okay, the topic of the talk is, yes, I changed the title, as you see, to the East South Slavic gerunds in Nik instead of transgressives, because I like this term more. I decided I will explain it in a second. Right, so this is the structure of my talk. First, I will talk a little bit about the East-South Slavic, that is Macedonian and Bulgarian gerund in general. Then I will go to this type nik that will be of interest in this talk. I will then discuss the existing historical explanations of this type. So this talk is purely historical. I am interested in historical morphology, not really in synchronic function. And then finally, I will propose a new hypothesis on the origin of this type. And then I will present some conclusions. So first, let us review what the gerund is. Gerund, yes, so the Bulgarian term de причастие, Macedonian glagolski prilog, also called the verbal adverb, adverbial participle, transgressive, which was my original title, gerundive, and so on. It is a well-known non-finite verbal form. It'll be familiar to everybody. In the standard languages, in both Bulgarian and Macedonian, the morpheme is ki. In Bulgarian, as you surely know, the history of this form in the literary language is very complicated. In the 19th century, many different forms were in use, but finally this one prevailed from the southwestern area. In Macedonian, of course, it corresponds to the local dialects. In dialects and historically, when one looks at these gerund forms, there is much more formal variety. So it's not just ki, of course, but many, many more different forms where the gerund is preserved, because in many places, in many dialects,
2014 curriculum, so that I know what I'm talking about.
There is some other,
I think. And then I'm afraid you're just a number, 513338. I think that was the Zoom passcode for this morning.
Excuse me, so
my name's Ross. I'm kind of interested in doing this English on a couple of online courses. I used to teach and tutor English in my 20s.
Okay.
Yeah, ти можеш... точно.
Моля?
All right. Okay. So yes, so in dialects and historically, there is much more variety. Also a functional and semantic, but I will not be talking about this. I'll be focusing only on form in this talk, not about the function and syntax. Okay, so this is just a list from a few dialectologies or historical grammars about this is just a list of different forms of the gerund in the dialects of both Macedonian and Bulgarian, the whole continuum. As you can see there, the variety is huge. I will not be reading out all these forms now, but you know, just a few. You have eiki, eikim, eikin, eshte, shtem, shten, shtim, shtin, shtets, shtimica, nik, nichki, these are the ones that will be of interest here, and many, many more others. So there are exhaustive collections that can be found in the literature, and you know, you can look them up. So some forms that are not included in the list we just saw, because they come from different places. A recent article by Iliev reports from a Pomak variety in Greece, gerunds in va. So we have forms such as sediova, glodava with this va. This is pretty interesting. I will talk about this later. And there are, of course, the forms known from historical texts only, but absent from modern vernaculars. So they are not there in the modern dialects, but in historical texts, they are well represented. And here, of course, we must mention the forms in ending originally in the nasal vowel. These are, of course, the old nominatives. I will be talking about this in a second. So this is the whole picture, the whole formal variety of the East South Slavic gerund. So as regards the historical origins of the category, generally they are, of course, completely clear. These are various forms of the common Slavic present active participle. And the forms develop from fossilized case forms by means of well-known processes that are similar in other Slavic languages too. There's a lot of literature on that. The process starts in Old Church Slavic already. The present active participle in Common Slavic had a stem in onch or in ench, depending on hard or soft verbal stems. And here I present a sort of sample from the inflection of this participle in Common Slavic, but also very characteristic is this nominative, which was shorter and did not feature this stem in ch. So hard I and soft n, these forms stood out from the paradigm. And they are pretty important in our later discussion too, so remember them. So this paradigm that we just saw gets changed. There are very many innovations already in canonical OCS and also afterwards. So for example, there is influence from more productive declensional classes. The nominative plural masculine changes from šte to shti. The nominative singular feminine changes from shti to shta. And these are well-known processes. This unique short nominative singular in ü gets replaced by en, which is a transfer from the soft stems, can also be replaced by on, which is a transfer from the oblique cases in onch. But the issue is complicated by the orthography of the nasal graphemes, and of course, in these texts. But that's a separate topic. But the important thing is that forms like naissant, naissonti, naissoncha, and so on, with these innovations, of course, with the correct reflexes of the nasal vowel and of ch, must have existed in living speech of early East South Slavic. So these are not just scribal things or whatever; they really existed in the speech of the early East South Slavic vernaculars. Later on, probably in the late Middle Ages, the inflected participle disappears from living speech, leaving only this gerund. All right, so what is the origin of this whole formal diversity that we saw in modern East South Slavic? Well, it is caused by a number of factors, as is well recognized: divergent reflexes of en, on, and ch, generalizations of theme vowels, so either this one or this one, with many truncations, resegmentations, recombinations with verbal stems, and so on. All of this leads to different forms. A very important generalization of particular gender number case forms of the participle. So different forms of the participle may provide the basis of the gerund, and also very important extensions with various particles and adverbial markers. The basic facts can be seen in the standard historical grammars, but there are also many specialized studies. I would like to highlight two recent studies by Maria Тодorова. Also, there is an article by Helgren in Scandoslavica from the 90s that sums up the different types in a very nice way. So where there are controversies in the historical explanation of these forms, they usually concern two things. First, it's the identification of the fossilized case form. For example, the type in tie, which means šte or tie or che or whatever, depending on reflex, has been interpreted as nominative plural masculine by some scholars, but also as the accusative singular neuter by other scholars. The forms chi and tiem, that is shti, ti, or shtem, tiem, these have been discussed even more. There are many different analyses which case form it is, and the literature has a lot of discussion on this. Also unclear sometimes is the explanation of these extensions following the fossilized case forms. So all these elements like ts, itza, n that appear on these forms, like shti, mitza, shtets, shtica, and so on, these also, it's sometimes unclear what they are. Are they particles, derivational suffixes, adverbial markers? It's widely discussed in the literature, and I again see the recent studies by Tërpomanova, for example, to see a lot of discussion on this. So what I attempt to do here is a basic historical typology of these forms. So this is very highly schematic and simplified. It's not, it doesn't tell the whole story, but I just want to show you how these forms are built in the different varieties. So in this table, all forms other than the nominative singular masculine are called oblique, and this includes also the nominative feminine and nominative plural. These are called oblique. All of these have the stem in ch. The nominative singular masculine has the stem in a vowel. All extensions are collected together, disregarding the origins, and I do not notate the reflex of the nasal vowel. So che is just, stands for onche and enche. So we have three types of forms. First, the bare nominative singular. These are just the forms in e, en, or on. They are only found in historical texts, not found in modern dialects. Then forms that are just the oblique case form without anything else. Forms in che, chi, and possibly chem, if this is the dative plural, for example. And then extended obliques. So forms like this, but with added extensions, these shtets, shtits, shtimitza, and shten, shtim, chen, chin, all these other forms with added things. So this is a basic typology of these forms. Then there is this form in va that I mentioned, discussed by Iliev, Serdyova, Glodava, and so on. Iliev says that this looks like a fossilized past active participle. So not the present active participle, but the past active participle. Iliev doesn't comment on the structure very much, but let's see that the only form in the paradigm of the past active participle that ended in v was the nominative singular masculine. Everywhere else, the stem was in vsh. So since the gerund ends in va and not vsha, this has to reflect a nominative singular masculine followed by an element a. So something like glendav plus a, giving us this glodava. So there's an unexpected shift of function. So Iliev himself says, в бъдеще предстои да се изясни въпросът дали освен да е причастна семантика, те пазят и семантика на минало деятелно първо причастие. Well, I don't know, but it's an interesting analysis anyway, and I will come back to this later. So now let us look at this type nik finally. So these are in the list of forms that I showed you before. These are the forms in nik. As you see, they are just interspersed among all these other types, even though they look completely differently. The gerunds of the type nik, it's actually, I just term it the type nik, it's my idea. It's a group of several similar types. So we have nik, nichki, nitsa, and so on and so on. I will show you them in a moment. I refer here to them conventionally as a type nik, but this refers to all types with initial n, right? So when I say nik, I mean all of them. They are found in the area mostly from the vicinity of Korcha in Albania to the vicinity of Kukush in Greece. So mostly south of the line of the Macedonian Greek border, roughly, but some forms are also known from outside of this zone. I will show you. The productivity of this type in nik is different in different varieties. It often competes with other types within a single dialect, but we'll look at this later. The material reviewed below is purely illustrative. It is not exhaustive. It is just arranged by structure. So we have forms in nik, say in Kostur, in Voden, in Gevgelia, in Kukush, Baranik, Placenik, Tarchanik, and so on. We have forms in Nitsa, Vikanica, Trchanica, Grabanica, and so on, in some of them in the same region, some of them in other regions. We have forms in Nichki, right? Grabanichki, Metenichki, Nichkim, Baranichkim, Baranichkim, Molenichkim, Płacenichkim, and so on. Nichku, Nichkum, again found in the South Albania area, Jedenichkum, Pisanichkum, Tarchenichkum, Nichkom also. We also have a couple of forms that are usually interpreted as substantives, like in na, nka, and nichuk, malchenata, kutskanka, molchenchuk, and so on. They are usually interpreted as substantives, but they seem to belong to the type nik etymologically too. So as I said, these gerunds in nik do not have the same productivity in all of the systems where they occur. In some localities, the type nik was described as productive, paradigmatic gerund form at the time of description of the dialect, say by Mazon in the 30s for Boboshchica. But even where it is productive, it often competes with other forms, usually of these normal types in ch. So for example, in Mazon's material from Boboshchica, we have forms in nichkim and nichkum, but also forms in shtem, like bariashtem and faliashtem. So they coexist, and Mazon says that they are identiques quant à leur emploi. So they are the same, they are parallel, just allomorphs. But in many locations, the use of the type nik is limited. They are often found only with a small number of verbs, lexicalized pretty much as the verbal adverbs of manner. And the real gerund may be served by the normal type in ch or be absent altogether. For example, in the area of Kostur, we have productive shtem or shtum, but some remnants of unproductive nik type, placenichkim, grabanichkim, only with a few verbs. In Voden, productive shchimica, but nik limited to a couple of verbs. Gevgelia, productive chi, and nik only with one verb, remnant. Okay, so let's look at the existing historical explanations of this type. As far as I can see, let's first focus on the historical explanations of this element n. This type is not much discussed in the literature. If I am missing something, please let me know. If you know of any other theories, I would be very happy to hear them because I didn't find much. Only one theory is, I think, available, that these gerunds are based on the past passive participle in n. For example, Widoewski writes, siteowie formy seobrazowani od snowata na glagolskata pridawka. Od nesvršený glagol wikan and then wikaniczki, wikaniczku. Similarly, malenko pasywnie od partycypna minato to vreme and so on. The same by mazon and mazon by yan, participe passif, right? And to this you get added some adverbial markers. As regards these explanations of these elements following the n, so they are similar to the types based on the oblique too. So right, the suffixes and adverbial markers and particles of different origins are added. These elements each are different because they are not found with types based on the oblique ch. So Widoewski thinks that they may be modeled on the nouns of the type maczenik. So zboru bruzowaczki od model na imenki na ik od typ od maczenik. It's a bit problematic. I think, why would you get the active meaning? Mączenik means martyr, not tormentor. Uczenik means disciple, not teacher. So it would be unclear how this would acquire this meaning. Mazon Vaillant have a more complicated scenario with the back formation, where this nik was back formed from a pseudo substantive in itza, which was actually used like an adverb, which is more complex, but perhaps more plausible. Anyway, the central problem is not in these extensions in ika, ichki, and so on. They are easy, understandable as adverbial elements. But the problem is this element n. Where does it come from? It's a bizarre thing. The association with the past passive participle, which is the usual theory, it is clearly present at a synchronic level, because we have in Boboszczyca a form like pominaticzkim with the t, right, in the past passive, in the form, like pominat from past passive participle from pomine. So it must be related somehow synchronically to the past passive participle, or perhaps to the verbal noun, which is itself derived from the past passive participle. In some dialects, things like tarczanica are synonymous with things like sotarczanie, right? So there is some association here, perhaps. But this theory is very problematic as the central diachronic explanations for at least 3 reasons. It would be the only instance in the entire history of Slavic where a paradigmatic gerund would not be from an active participle, but from something else. It would be very bizarre. And if indeed it is from a different source than the active participle, why would we then expect it to find only where the normal gerund from ch has been lost, right? But this is not the case. The forms of type nik and forms of type ch often coexist. The type nik is often limited and lexicalized, and type ch is more productive. So if anything, nik gives the impression of an archaism and not as a recent replacement. And the third thing already mentioned, if it is from the passive participle, why active meaning? Perhaps you could go via the verbal noun or via periphrastic constructions like imam videno, which are indifferent to diathesis, but it is still a major problem. It is unexpected. So the conclusion is that the association with the past passive participle, it exists synchronically, but is unlikely to be the real diachronic source. So the origin of this type nik is still an open question. And the ideal candidate, of course, would be an active participle, right? As all other gerunds in Slavic. Is there a formal possibility to do this from the active participle? So this is my new hypothesis now. So let us recall this typology. We had the 3 forms, right? The 3 types: bare nominative singular, bare oblique, and extended oblique. And one theoretically possible combination that is missing here would be an extended nominative singular masculine, right? If an extension was added to the fossilized nominative singular masculine, what form would be expected? To answer this question, let's review the few similar cases in Slavic. So there is a well-known phenomenon where derivatives from the type in ent yield derivatives in n. Telen, telente, kaf gives you telenuk. And this is the source of the well-known regular Russian suppletion tilionak, but teliata. Similar phenomena are found in West Slavic, in Slovak, for example. You also have different pairs such as moldente, but moldence, dieten, dietente, dietenece, and so on. Many other things like this. Slavski, the historical word formation, has a lot of discussion on this. The traditional analysis is that this represents segmentability of ent into n plus 2, right? So under this interpretation, which is widespread, the derivatives attest an older stem in n, when the basic noun has a secondary extension with t, right? So the derivatives are from telen, telenek, but the basic noun has telente, which is an extension. This is found in very many works, for example, these, very widespread interpretation. I think it is actually very problematic. I cannot discuss the origin of ent here because the literature is massive. See recently the monograph by Petrov. But despite the claims to the contrary, the Indo-European background of ent is actually quite unclear. The analysis n plus 2 does not really seem very likely, and it's much more uniform that it's much more probable that it's a uniform Proto-Indo-European t, or maybe even a contamination. Even if the segmentation is correct at some level, which is doubtful, its persistence as late as post-Common Slavic is very improbable. So a shallower Slavic internal explanation of telen to telenuk would be more realistic. Henning Andersen has a forthcoming article where he says something like this. So the type telenek, dietenets has nothing to do with segmentability of n. Simply, these forms are derived from the nominative singular in n, as in the type kamik from kame, even though the oblique is kamen, right? You derive from the nominative singular. So telen plus uk gives you telenek. Deten plus uts gives you detenets. Why do you get this unetymological resolution of the nasal vowel as n? There are different possibilities. Maybe it's just analogy with the type, with the n stems. Yemen, yemen gives you yemenen. So in the same way, deten, detenets. Maybe it's just a more phonological recasting of the nasal vowel as n in prevocalic position, or some other possibilities are possible too. But it's clearly possible. So here, this process can also be used to explain the gerunds of the type nik, right? So the fossilized nominative singular in L, used as a gerund, documented in texts, extended with something like itza and ik, giving you placen plus itza, placenica, even though the actual oblique stem was in L, right? It's derived from the nominative singular. Here is a table where I compare these different processes with the etymological stem and this unetymological prevocalic resolution of L. Right, so even though the real oblique stem is in ent, you derive a derivative in n. Similarly, placent, you derive a derivative in placenica, and so on. Yes, in the chronology, this mechanism would work the most natural while n was phonetically still a nasal vowel, which works well for East South Slavic, where nasal vowel persisted much longer. But it's not really necessary because it could also be abstracted as a more phonological rule. So as patterns of the type deten, detenetsu were robust, speakers may abstract a rule, insert n when deriving from a form in e, and that would be just this. So the extensions following the n, as I said, the origins are pretty elusive. Like in the gerunds based on ch, they are heterogeneous and chronologically diverse. I will not discuss all of them here now. This form nica may be the original one because it has a counterpart in shtimitza and a good possible origin in adverbs in itzeyon. These other ones can be back-formed or formed with productive adverbial morphology, which I will not discuss now here, but the possibilities are there. The secondary association with the past passive participle is there. As I said, after the type in n arose, it got secondarily associated with the past passive participle. For example, in verbs with the stem in a, forms like anik, anichki probably are by convergence with the past passive participle in an. But it's difficult to say what the original ayan would have given. Ayanik, difficult to say because there are too many changes, morphological changes in the verbal stems and in the gerund morpheme itself. Thus, the past passive participle clearly influenced the gerund of the type nik, but it is unlikely to be the original source. Okay, so we have some implications. The theory based on the old nominative singular. Usually it is said that no gerunds based on the nominative singular survive in modern East South Slavic vernaculars. This theory would change this picture. Secondly, the type in va studied by Iliev, we saw that it also seems to be based on an old nominative singular of the past participle with an extension. So it would be an exact structural parallel to our explanation here. Thirdly, it is notable that the gerunds of the type nik are often lexicalized as adverbs of manner, while paradigmatic gerunds are served by a form from ch. Similar situation is found in Slovenian. In Slovenian, there are two types of gerunds, one from the nominative, other from the oblique, where they occur together. The one from the nominative is often lexicalized as an adverb of manner, like sedel, sede from sitting position, hotel, hote intentionally on purpose, whereas things such as sedech, hotech are actual present gerunds of sit and want. So this would be an exact structural parallel to my explanation. Okay, so conclude because we don't have time. Summary: the dialectal East South Slavic gerund nik, nica, nichkim, and so on is not a derivative of the past passive participle as traditionally assumed, rather a fossilized nominative singular masculine, such as found in texts, but with extensions with unetymological prevocalic resolution of the nasal vowel, like in type teleon, telenik, or dieteon, dietenets. Gerunds in nik often limited and lexicalized as adverbs of manner, like in Slovenian, the gerunds based on the nominative singular. And the typology, therefore, that I presented has to be updated so that we add extended nominative singular forms here with this prevocalic resolution and etymological of this sort. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And this is me in the land of the gerunds in nik, somewhere in the Prespa region. I would like to go back there very soon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Благодаря много на Марек за интересния доклад, за изключително интересния доклад. Аз предполагам сега, че ще има много въпроси, че ще има въпроси и дискусия, но тъй като вече навлязохме във времето на Орсът, мисля да направим дискусията, ако вие сте съгласни, след...
Не, по-добре е да закъснеем. Докладът е много интересен и беше много трудно нещо да се съкрати.
Орсът, да закъснеем ли малко?
По-добре е да закъснеем за всеки доклад, защото впечатленията ще се объркат. Следващия доклад е съвсем друга тема.
Добре. Виждам, че Екатерина Търпоманова вдигаше ръка. Вдигаш ли?
Моля?
Заповядай.
Аз очаквам старобългаристи тук има.
Сега тя вдигна ръка.
Кой?
Не съм, това бяха аплодисменти.
Това са аплодисменти.
Добре, аз тогава имам
заслужени.
Много дълбок на Марек Майер, много дълбок анализ, поставя въпроси, които човек рядко си поставя, защото преминават морфеми от една категория в друга категория. Сега, този суфикс, как да го нарека, формант, ник, който е в герунди влиза, при него имаше и такива примери от ент основи, като теленце, детенце, нали, и така нататък. Сега, в една друга категория, пак номинална, или на съществително, на номен, това е номина агентис на ник. Ученик, мъченик. Имаше там един мъченик в неговите примери. Много интересно би било да се знае преминаването от една категория на суфикс в друга, където той получава нови функции. Например, ник, номина агентис в славянските езици, заед в романски и в албански, като прилагателно, за аджектив. Да кажем трашник в албански, груб, или потерник в романски, мощен. Гълъбов смята, че те са заети по едно и също време, защото сменят функцията си. От съществително, от субстантив стават форманти за аджектив. А вие тук имате от субстантив, мъченик, вашия пример, става за герунди, което е все пак глаголно-именна категория.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for these interesting remarks. I don't want to take too much time away from Orsat, so my reply will be very, very quick. As regards the type, you mentioned the type telen, tk, telen, tc, and so on. These derivatives are also found, of course, something like Polish czelontko or Czech telatko, but these are easy to understand because they are productive. They are just from the oblique stem, so this is expected. And the sort of lectio difficilior is the type telenek, which is unexpected. So that's why I focused on this. As regards the second thing, so I actually think that the association with agent noun suffix in nik is just secondary. It's a sort of folk etymology, while the real origin would be in the present active participle. But definitely in the mind of the speakers, they must be connected, and people definitely connected it. Synchronically, it's an interesting thing. I also thought of tor. Actually, I thought of tor in Albanian, in Balkan Romance, but I didn't find any examples of gerundive-like use. If there are any, I would be very happy to see them, because that would be a very, very interesting parallel. Thank you very much, Professor, for your remarks. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Аз благодаря. Аз съм тъс, която ви благодаря.
Благодаря.
Дали има някой, който иска да каже нещо?
Малко закъсняхме, 5 минути.
Ами, ако няма за сега, може някой да измисли после някакви въпроси към говорещите в тази секция, към всички.
Нали? По чата. Има чат. Има чат.
Добре е да се споделя пред всички. Нали? Затова е workshop или езикова работилница, както се казва. Ами, ако няма за сега повече въпроси, аз съм направила Орсът хост и му давам думата, за да представи неговия доклад, който е за илирийските местни имена, които са произведени от глаголни корени, образувани от глаголни корени. Заповядай, Орсът.
Хвала, Биляна. Should first say that sorry, I was a bit late this morning. I overslept, but I hope I made it in time. And don't worry about the questions. I'm more than happy to concede some of my time to Marek. I think I find his lecture more interesting than mine. But let me try to do something here as well. See if I can share the screen. Okay, you can see it. Is it okay?
Да.
Great. You see, well, first of all, thank you again for having me this year. Always very happy to give a lecture. You see that the topic of this lecture is not exactly meant to be perhaps part of exactly this conference. It's perhaps a bit too arcane or too ancient. So this is why I was very happy to concede some of my time to Marek. But still, I will try to make something out of it, and should perhaps say how it is that I came to do this topic. Well, you know how it is. They are making some sort of encyclopedia of Slavic languages. And somebody said we should have, you know, an entry on Illyrian and Slavic, and, you know, whom should we give it to? Well, perhaps Orsat can do it. He does all of these very strange languages. You know, once in your life you do Phrygian, and for the rest of your life, people think you do all of the fragmentary Indo-European languages. So I had to make something out of this topic. And well, Illyrian is a very difficult case, as you might know. It is much more difficult than Phrygian. So in Phrygian, you know, you have perhaps, I don't know, 200, 300 inscriptions. They are divided in two groups. There are old Phrygian inscriptions, new Phrygian inscriptions. You can see some historical variation in between the old Phrygian inscriptions and the new Phrygian inscriptions. You get loanwords, Phrygian loanwords in other neighboring languages. You also get the reverse case, so Greek loanwords, for instance, in Phrygian. So there is things to go on with the Phrygian, really. And Illyrian is everything exactly the opposite of Phrygian. So in Illyrian, first, there are no texts. And there are 4 glosses. Okay, 4 glosses. Perhaps in Phrygian you have some I don't know, perhaps 100 or 120 glosses or so. Okay, perhaps they are not all Phrygian exactly, but still there is perhaps 100 glosses. This is now all has been very well done by my dear friend Tomeu. From the Barcelona University, who did his PhD thesis on this, and he has an entire list of these glosses, and I think there is something like 100 of them. In Illyrian there are 4, and 1 is doubtful. So the only thing which you really have when you're doing Illyrian are place names, and also island names, river names, names at any rate, also personal names. Now, personal names in Illyrian have been masterfully done by the late Radoslav Katičić already in the 70s and in the 80s. So when you're doing these other names, so place names, river names, hill names, and so forth, you're actually building on his work. I should then perhaps show you first. I will skip the first slide for a moment. How should we do this? Like so. And go here. I wanted to show you this map, which will be on every slide. And this is actually what derives from Katičić's work. It is the division of this opaque term Illyrian in 3 sections. And we think these 3 sections represent 3 Illyrian dialects. They are called Illyrian proper. So this is, you know, like the Orange dialect. So Dalmato-Pannonian, which is a green dialect, and this blue dialect, which is called Liburnian. And okay, perhaps there was an additional one also here called Histrian, you know, covering the other part of Istria and a part of Slovenia and so forth, going, touching Venetian, well, Venetian, Venetic on the other side. How do we know that these 3 regions are distinct from one another? Well, you know, Katičić and other people very carefully inspected the names. And, you know, like you get in Latin and in Greek, there are specific naming formulas. So, you know, it has a nomen, cognomen, prenomen, and so forth. And if you inspect these regions and the inscriptions you find there, you know, also filled with Illyrian names. And actually here, you can distinguish clearly between names in Illyrian proper, in the region of Illyrian proper, in the region of Dalmato-Pannonian, and in the region of Dalmato-Liburnian. Now, this may be important and may not be important, because, of course, the fact that you have a different name does not mean, does not imply that you speak a different language. For instance, here in Serbo-Croatia, I have a very specific name. Not many people have this name, but this, of course, does not imply that I do not speak Serbo-Croatian. So, you know, you can take this with a grain of salt, this division in 3 sections. It may mean something and it may not mean something. We simply just do not know at the present. Well, let me go back one slide. Here, well, you can see at a glance the semantic fields which concern the etymologies of place names. Now, before I show you this colorful wheel, I must say that all of the etymologies discussed in this presentation are not my own. They have all been taken from, the only such work that deals with Illyrian, and it is the Myers, not Anton Myers, not Marek Myers, book on Illyrian, which is from the 50s, and it is a bit dated now, but you know, you can read it quite well. And there have also been 2 other titles which anybody doing these kinds of things should consider, and this is the Anwriter's book on the names of Pannonia, and well, my dear friend Dubravka Ivšić's PhD thesis on the pre-Slavic stratum in Slavic toponymy. Perhaps also before I begin with these etymologies, should tell you, you know, how do you recognize an Illyrian name? There aren't any kind of fixed criteria. Mostly, Illyrian is a diagnosis of exclusion. So, for instance, you see Illyrian is mostly attested in this, kind of West Balkans, you know, including present-day Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Albania. So, the kind of loanwords that you get here is mostly Greek, Latin, then all sorts of Romance loanwords, Dalmatian Romance, Italian, Venetian. Other than that, you get loanwords from you know, one language to the other, for instance, from Albanian to Serbo-Croatian and vice versa. So when you're dealing with a name, if you get rid of all other options, so the name is not, I don't know, Greek, it's not Latin, it's not Italian, it's not Albanian, and it's not German or Turkish or something else, well, then you can consider perhaps that it is Illyrian if it is not pre-Indo-European. And really, it is sometimes easier to distinguish, to identify a pre-Indo-European name than it is to identify an Illyrian name. And this happens because, of course, pre-Indo-European names, there are, you know, loanwords all over the Mediterranean, so you can compare easily. And if you have Illyrian, there is really nothing to compare. And also there is one other very special and very nasty detail. So this is this kind of notion of called Old European, and which mostly, you know, concerns hydronymy, so names of rivers and so forth, which is pre-Illyrian at any rate. And is very, very, very difficult to distinguish a Old European from Illyrian place name. And this is why I excluded any kind of river names and lake names and so forth from this consideration. It is almost impossible to do this. Of course, I mean, it is possible you would do it the same way you do with the pre-European, Indo-European names. So you would try to find a similar root in some river name somewhere else, for instance, in France or in wherever, you know. But still, the fact that you find it here in the Illyricum does not, of course, mean ipso facto that it must be Old European. It could have been Illyrian as well. Okay, so that is perhaps a small introduction on how you tell an Illyrian name. Also, there are some suffixes that occur very frequently in Illyrian names. We know this. So, for instance, this is the suffix ona, which you can see almost in every second Illyrian place names. Also, there is another one, so inium. And there is another one, so ist, istos, ista, and so forth. But mostly that's it. So suffixes, and consider every other option before considering Illyrian. If you look at the place names, you know, all of these on the eastern, on the western coast of the Adriatic, and you will not find many of such Illyrian names. There are perhaps some 60 of them, and here I've divided them, their etymologies at least, in some fields, so you can see what they concern. And you can see that very small number of these place names derives from the size, from the reference to the size, to the position, to the place. A bit more refer to animals, plants, and people, and also to the standing water, right? It's very interesting. There is an opposition between standing water and flowing water in etymology. You might even expect this, of course. And what else? What else? Well, then, of course, you get these groups which are more popular in the naming history. So 3 refer to soil and to other minerals. 4 refer to color. 4 also referred to whether place is old or new. This is all, mostly, you know, in phrases like old city, new city. And there is a very large group which concerns stones of all kinds, also including rocks and cliffs and hills and mountains. Each group has 4 place names, and then one rather abstract group which has to do with bends and curves. Say this kind of bend or that kind of bend, which refers usually to the bends of the river. Right, and then the largest group concerns, either refers to water, but flowing water. And here I told you that I excluded river names, so you can see that, of course, water still features prominently in place names. It's a very important factor. Now I thought I would show you all of the groups, if I could. Well, very, very quickly. I won't bother you with them. And here you see dark and bright. And what I wanted to do in this lecture is look at the etymology of each group you see, and you know, try and single out the verbal roots. And where I find the verbal root, so I put it in bold like this, so you can see it. Well, very quickly you see if you have place names which derive from color, we all get these very known Indo-European roots. So, for instance, the root helbch means white, like in Latin albus. And then this leuconum, the other root leuk, for instance, as in Greek leukos, as in Sanskrit lokach, so meaning white, and then also world. And also this kind of the root for silver, for instance, as in Greek argyros, and the root for dark, as in, for instance, Greek orphnos. So here, you really the only verbal root is this leuk, but already in Indo-European it formed early derivatives, which had kind of a shifted meaning. So, for instance, you know, the meaning of Latin lucus, so the place in the woods where you cut the trees so that the sun can shine in. So this really not a true, not probably a proper verbal derivative of Illyrian, but something rather older. Okay, moving quickly to this category of new and old. Well, this mostly refers to probably the new and the old city. And interestingly enough, we do have the word for city, which survives in one place name, which I will show you later. And the Latin form of it is pola. So here you really must understand Jovia pola, Jovista pola, Senia pola, and Sunista pola. And these are how should I say, place names derived from the Indo-European roots, meaning, well, mostly life, long life, so something like Sanskrit ayu, or a Western ayu, genitive yaosh, the famous one, and Senia, you know, from such form as Greek henos, Armenian hin, and so forth. And this suffix ista, I don't really know what it is. It could be, of course, just an adjective suffix, but of course could be also a superlative suffix, as I've reconstructed here. But you really cannot say. There is nothing to go on. And here, for instance, you see same. Some of these names, where they have Slavic counterparts, I wrote them down. Okay, so here I forgot, but otherwhere I hope you can see them. Size and position. Well, only one example each. So for size, we have this name Massaron, referring to a hill which overlooks the city of Split. But this must be wrong, so this etymology. You see here, this village to use the assumption that Illyrian is a Sartem language, which is still an unknown fact. It could be and it couldn't be. In fact, there is a very good indication that it might not be a Sartem language, and this is the name Gentius, so the consort of Teuta, the Illyrian queen. His name is usually derived from European verbal root gen, meaning to beget and to give birth to, and then also meaning child and so forth. And you can see that the reflex of the palatovelar g of gen is just not palatalized. So, you know, if the etymology of Gentius is okay, then this etymology cannot be okay. And the other thing that is very strange in it is the fact that it requires European root to be in O grade, which is usually not at all found in O grade. It is almost exclusively found in E grade. So something like Greek megas, Sanskrit mahan, so Old Phrygian mekas, New Phrygian mekas, and so forth. Armenian mets, it's always E grade. So I'd probably say this is a wrong etymology. And this metulon, the etymology I simply do not, it looks made up. It could be so, could not be so. The only fact that it has going for it is the nit counterpart it has in Albanian. Well, there's really no time, but I should say here that for as much we can see, there is, it seems, a definite connection between Illyrian and Messapic. And you know, most people, when they do Indo-European and they even write some sort of textbooks, they will be very careful in this this place, not to give a too definitive definition of the place of Illyrian in Indo-European family tree. But there are really some three coincidences, the word for daughter, a name, and the word for sheep, which would beg to differ. And really seems that there is a special connection in between Messapic and Illyrian. And since the Matzinger's new book on Messapic, we can also see that there is a rather close connection between Mesapic and Albanian. So the fact that you do get here this Albanian, how should I say, cognate is perhaps indicative. This particle is not too frequently found in Indo-European languages. It has a very specific distribution. Moving on to rocks and cliffs. Well, this is a very popular etymology. If you're an Illyrian, you want to point out that you're living on a rock or under a rock or so forth. So there are many, many names for rocks and cliffs. You can see that two of them, so this Scardona and Scarda, derive from the Proto-Indo-European root sker, which is a root which means to cut. Probably meaning something to cut, and then something that's cut off, and then something that is steep, and then the cliff. There are more place names which derive from this root. Here I've named only these two. You can see that they are very neat. Because one was borrowed before the Slavic metathesis, liquid metathesis, and the other was borrowed after. So the metathesis only happens in one form. And the other two roots, which deal with rocks, also probably are also verbal roots, but their derivatives, which mean rock, are also tested in other languages. So for instance, you see here the root hreup, which is behind the Latin verb rumpo, so something like to break. And then also you get already in Latin rupes, so something broken off or a cliff. This is not a unique derivative in Illyrian. And here you see this other etymology, Assamum, the present-day Trebinje, which again cannot be true. You see here the palato-velar K supposed to yield an SS here. And also I've showed you here that Masaron should also palato-velar G should yield an SS. And there is simply no reason to believe that the palato-velar G and the palato-velar K would match. And even if they did, we know that this is a men derivative in Indo-European, so it's the famous one, so the one, the root of kamen and so forth. But if this is so, what is this R? And it cannot explain it etymologically. And of course, the word for stone, the Indo-European hakm and so forth, is derived from a verbal root. So the root hak, meaning to be sharp, something like in Latin akeo, so to be acidy. But of course, this is a Proto-Indo-European derivative. So I think also this etymology must be wrong. However, it is very important to notice that these two verbs do get this SS, which at present I don't know how to explain, from which Indo-European source. More on this, just 5 minutes more, if you can bear with me. Also something on hills and mountains. You see here a very interesting case of this bilubium, which was reconstructed by Meyer, but this was when we believed that the by of Germanic be, by, English by, and so forth, derived from this be, and we know today it is not so. It derives from a epi, and it is simply a Werner variant of epi. So this cannot be true. And of course, when you're doing etymology, instantly what comes to mind, perhaps you should like to have the we here, so meaning two, perhaps something like two hills. But this is ad hoc, because you don't know for a fact that dwa would yield b. It does so in Latin and in the Western, but there is no other case in Illyrian which would confirm this. There are, though, names which have number as the first component, as the first element of a compound. For instance, there is teuta and there is triteuta. So perhaps you could have dvilobium, okay, but you don't know that dv would yield a b. Okay, so this is not a verbal root, it is an old root meaning skull. And you see, it's very interesting that both words for hills and mountains in Illyrian derive from Indo-European verbs meaning skull or head. So some sort of universal metaphor. Though this case here is very, very suspicious. You see here a GH in the European is supposed to yield a K, which is okay. This happens in Greek, but of course in Greek this is a consequence of Grassmann's law, and there is no reason to believe that Grassmann's law ever existed in Illyrian, and even if it did existed, why would it yield a K when the Indo-European voiced aspirated consonants usually yield a voiced reflex? So this etymology is probably wrong as well. Okay, so other words for hills and mountains derived from Indo-European words, verb roots, and you can see that the derivatives exist elsewhere in Indo-European, which already mean hill. So it's something like probably Proto-Indo-European derivative from this root kelch, kelchen, which meant hill already in Indo-European, so it was inherited in Illyrian rather than invented there. And there is also this idea that promona perhaps has to do with men of Latin emineo, so to stand out, but this is clearly not the case. Because there are too many things gone wrong in this etymology. For instance, you can see that this first O remains an O, doesn't yield an R as it should, and then you really need to suppose that this O of the root men was long in order to get this O. And also, you know, the segmentation probably could not be exactly on point, because you can also say, okay, I not need to, you know, segment it like pro, mon, a. Perhaps I can do it as prom, ona. And ona, you have seen from Salona and other examples, is a suffix which is very frequent. Okay, so here I will, well, perhaps go very quickly through this. You can see two names deriving from verbal roots, one to be dry and other to bear, and both presumably meant ground, but the meaning ground can also be found in other Indo-European languages. For instance, next to tarsatica you can find Latin terra, ground, and next to tellurium find Latin tellus, and also Old Irish words meaning ground. Also here, you know, you have this name derived from the root for salt, still meaning salt, probably salt mine in Illyrian. Okay, and well, this is mostly it. There are some 3 or 4 slides more, I suppose. Some of the names are derived from animals, so this is alcinium and aluminium, but you see the derivatives, for instance, the L derivative to this root dhech is already in the European, and you know, if you make a derivative from the root meaning to suckle, you mostly get the meaning female, and then, you know, there is a very small jump in the meaning from female to sheep. And this is the only verbal root on this slide, all other are nominal. Here, I've promised you I would show you the root, which means the city, is the pola, as of course a nominal root, and so is teuta. By the way, this etymology is wrong, but if you're interested in that, you can ask me. Here is genta, which supposedly proves that Illyrian was Kentum language, but I wouldn't bet on it. It is derived from, of course, a verbal root, which in this derivative mostly, get something meaning like son or daughter, like Latin natus or diognetos and so forth. Bends and curves, and this is the penultimate slide, I promise. All bends and curves derive from verbal roots, but if you look closely, you will see that there are always derivatives somewhere in Indo-European, which are already nominal and which have already acquired some sort of geographical meaning. So, for instance, if you have the root for to bend, there is always some in the European language in which this means, for instance, bay or valley or something like this. And if you have the root, the other root meaning to bend, well, then there is an Indo-European language in which this means hill or high, right? So, interestingly enough, kokonai and kukium, the root keuk is the same as in the English word high, as we get hoch and so forth, haug. And this epilentium, I will just make a little footnote here. Okay, you can derive it from this root, but interestingly enough, this root is limited to Balto-Slavic. This is where, so you would have a Balto-Slavic isogloss, which would be very improbable. Well, now really the time has passed, and I will just skip to the conclusion. Here you can see a little chart, with two, yellow and orange, and you see wherever it is yellow, it means derived from a nominal root, and whenever you have orange, it's derived from a verbal root. And of course, expectedly, most verbal derivatives have to do with either motion, found in place names which denote bends and curves, or with the moving of the water. Other place names derived mostly from nominal roots. Well, that's it. Thank you. I won't take any more of your time. Thank you.
Много благодаря на Оксат за този много интересен и вълнуващ доклад. Много ти благодаря. И това накрая беше много интересен този анализ.
Хвала.
И сега ние вече сме така извън времето на първата ни част, но все пак, който иска, може да зададе въпроси към първите три доклада. Ако някой има нови въпроси, ето сега ще дам думата на Марек. Нали ръка вдигаш, искаш думата, нали?
Yes, just one very quick question. Thank you, Orsat, for this masterful talk, as always. Even though you cited other Mayers, that's fine. I won't be jealous. I wanted to a very, very quick question, because a big question could be how exactly you distinguish between verbal roots and adjectival. It's not always super clear-cut, but that's an Indo-Europeanist discussion. But one detail, on slide 9, your reconstruction of wolf had the E grade, and I'm curious whether that is
yes.
your idea or some. I just
no. Just let me share the screen again very quickly. Okay, so here it is, slide 9. You mean here?
Yes. I mean the E grade in this room.
Yes. Whenever I imagine you're writing an Indo-European dictionary, and of course you would have to, use roots as lemmata. And then, of course, whenever I have a root, I would reconstruct the most probable E grade. and prefer to quote Indo-European roots in this form. Of course, all derivatives from this root is from the 0 grade, and there are no, as far as I know, no E grades from wolf. And this is a principle, you know, I borrow from live. It's not something mine.
Okay. I thought maybe you had some evidence for the E grade from this root.
No. Really don't have any. But you know, it's a very neat correspondence I find. Here in Ulkinium, and of course Ulk or Uik Albanian, and this Ulk, and it's interesting how, you know, if you have. If you're doing Indo-European, this is probably the first word that they will show you. It's really a very difficult word because it either has a metathesis, which is found in one of the classical languages, or it has the delabilization of qua. Whereas, you know, only, for instance, something like kvarkach would really show you the true Indo-European form behind it. But here also, ironically, Albanian and Illyrian, supposedly, yes. So it's not that simple word.
Други въпроси към Орсът от слушателите?
Да, аз искам да кажа нещо. За съжаление, камерата не може да ми се включи.
Няма проблема.
Hi, Orsat. Thank you very much. It was very interesting for me.
Mm-hmm.
And the big question for me is, who are the real Illyrians?
Yes.
Actually. And how we can distinguish these many tribes in West Balkans. Are they all Illyrians? And for me, this is very, very difficult.
It is truly so. It is extremely difficult to tell Illyrians apart from themselves mostly, because you know, historical sources quote different tribes.
Yes,
and
yes.
These borders on the map I showed you, you know,
Yes.
these are from Strabo, from Ptolemy, and from Pliny. But interesting.
Illyria propria dicti.
Yes. And interestingly enough, the study by Katičić, so the study of names, confirms these historical borders. So the borders are approximately there where you would expect them. And you know, it is the river Kolapis, and it is the river Neretva, Naron, and so forth. Okay, so we can distinguish them from themselves. And then, of course, there is a myriad of tribes, you know, the Yapodes, these and those, and so forth. But this is mostly confusing. So perhaps when you're trying to do Illyrian, it's best to use these this tripartite division into Liburnian, Dalmato-Pannonian, and Illyrian proper.
Yes.
And as to the question who they were, well, of course, we do not know, and it is a very heated question. Because, as you know, it is also a national question in Albania. But when, you know, when I initially studied Indo-European, it was, you know, Illyrians were these, you know, people who somehow were in between everybody else and unrelated to everybody else. But then, you know, I was forced by these people from the encyclopedia to start working on this and look at it more closely. And also I had a student of mine now is very good in Masapic, so I can ask him if I don't know. And I really now started to believe that there is something very fundamental, a fundamental connection in between in between Albanian and Illyrian. And there is a very interesting thing that happens here, because there is one other place where you can find Illyrian words, and this is in Serbo-Croatian, and also occasionally in Bulgarian, and occasionally also in Romanian. And okay, they are perhaps not all Illyrian, perhaps some of them are Thracian, perhaps some of them are Dacian, perhaps some are Thracian and Illyrian. But the fact is that their distribution, geographical distribution, is such that they could not have been borrowed from Proto-Albanian. For instance, you find them in Istria. There is no geographical connection between Proto-Albanian and Istria. So they must have,
I'm sure, yes.
Must have come from some language which was already there. And all of these words, incidentally, have something to do with farming. So it is, you know, cow dung, or some sort of milking instrument, or, you know, and this also somehow makes the whole thing more difficult, because, as you know, in the Balkans, there are these farming communities which are nomadic. So go from place to place where you can, you know, find pasture for your sheep or cows or whatever not. So it's rather complicated, but if you have a loanword, how do you now distinguish? The question becomes, how do you distinguish such a loanword? How do you distinguish between Illyrian and Proto-Albanian? Now, this is almost impossible. Yes, but you know, so these are the things that I've been doing lately, and they're not easy at all. Yes.
And about this name Asamum.
Yes.
Maybe you know that we have here in Bulgaria a river name with this old name Asamus.
Yes,
which originates also from the same root Indo-European. Yes.
Yes, I do know this, and I think that well, for Asamum I considered other options as well, and I skipped it. But there is also the name Aseria in Illyrian, and this looks actually like an R adjective to the root, Aseria next to Asamum, and it's very interestingly derived from a root which doesn't have an M. So it looks like an R derivative from a root rather than from a nominal derivative, meaning stone. And, you know, it could be all sorts of things, depending on your definition of, well, Illyrian phonology. And as far as we know, there are two sources to Illyrian R, as though it's from Proto-Indo-European age to AE, so the usual one. And the other one is O, short O. But, okay, perhaps there are some other possibilities. For instance, I like to consider this root for ash tree. So the os root with a long O, but the problem is that the long O yields a long O, and yeah. I mean, if you were to you know look at it from a purely etymological point of view, of course. You are more likely to find a root etymology with a root that starts with H2 and then has an E grade than from something that just has an O grade. So perhaps that's a place to start looking.
Yes. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Ами, ако има други въпроси по другите
доклади,
няма
време за други въпроси.
Ами няма, но който